Can you see it? Can you see okay?
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, okay.
Good. You can hear me, I guess. Okay. So I'm going to talk about raptor migration, which occurs throughout the whole world. It really is a worldwide phenomenon. And those of us who live in a country where we just have a few raptor counts or counts locally, we don't realize that it's happening over the whole world. Okay. As many as 183 species, or more than half of all the species of raptors in the world, perform some kind of migration. That is, they leave normally the breeding area for part of the year. Why do these birds migrate? Why do they have to leave? Well, the simple answer is there's usually not enough food throughout the year for them to stay there. There's enough food during usually the summer in the northern hemispheres for them to breed, but in the winter there's not enough food, so they have to leave. Also in places like Africa, there is a wet season, dry season movement, where during the wet season there's enough food, but during the dry season there is not enough food for breeding and staying. I'm going to use this book to show many maps of where raptors concentrate and where people might get there to try to count the raptors. As I mentioned, we'll have many maps to show you where they concentrate. Now, most of the raptor migration is broad front and not concentrated. But I want to show a picture of Keith Bilstein, who is the Conservation Education Director at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, and the moving force behind this book. One of the maps shows places where raptors are counted, and these are only counts where more than 10,000 raptors are counted in any one year. And so you can see that there are quite a few of them, but they're very concentrated, and so I'm going to be talking about them on a continent by continent basis. Notice that most of these counts are in the northern hemisphere. And the reason for that is very simple. It's a geography. The land mass, most of the land mass on the Earth is in the northern hemisphere, and the land mass of the northern parts of the continents go much closer toward the North Pole than they do on the South Pole. So most of the migration then is in the northern hemisphere. And what we're experiencing here are northern hemisphere birds coming south for the winter. It's interesting that Asia has the most migrant raptor species of any of the continents, with Africa being a close second. I'm also going to be getting a lot of data from this book, Migration Ecology of Birds by Ian Newton. Professor Newton is from the UK. It has in this book one chapter just on raptor migration and raptor counts. So of all of the world's species, only a few of them does the entire population leave the breeding area. And there's a list of these on the left-hand side. In other species, most of the population leaves the breeding area, and you can see that on the right-hand side. For the rest of these species, more than 150 of them, only the northernmost in the case of northern hemisphere or the southernmost in the case of southern hemisphere raptors move. And because at the northern end of the range the winter is severe, but at the southern end of the range of many of these species there's enough food for them to stay year-round. And it's best for them to stay year-round. If you're a breeding raptor, it's best for you to maintain your territory and not give it up. But if it gets so bad that another raptor of that species can't take the territory when you're away, then you leave. But you get back before the other person does, the other raptor. Well, the count sites are necessarily at places where there are birds to count, concentrations, where there is this phenomena of seeing the raptors move and be able to count them in great numbers, such as the place we are right now. But most of the migration is on a broad front because the raptors, if they're in the north, in northern hemisphere, in the autumn, they want to go south or in a southerly direction. And so they take off from wherever they are, and the range of these is sometimes quite broad, and they migrate south. And it's only when they're concentrated that we see them. So what concentrates raptors? Why do raptors concentrate at certain places, such as where we are right here? Well, raptors generally are dependent on air currents, rising air currents. And I have a cup of coffee and a cup of water. Thank you very much. So I may stop once in a while to get a cup. So, rising air. And raptors are very efficient in their migration in that they usually, much of the time, don't flap. All they do is set their wings out like this, and they ride a thermal, which is a rising air column, circling, going up, or they use an updraft off of a hill where they rise, or they just use the actual strength of the air to migrate. And so as a result, they can go great distances with just burning off just barely enough energy, basic metabolic rate, so that they don't have to put lots of fat on, or they can go a long distance with a lot of fat. Other birds actually flap when they're up. So we'll see drongos here and swallows, and we'll see bee-eaters, and they're flapping. They're using their wings and burning up more energy, but raptors are more efficient. So the problem then is when raptors encounter water bodies, and in this particular case it's the Mediterranean Sea on the south part of Europe. When raptors encounter water, the thermals over water are much weaker and they're different, and there is no place to perch once you get out over the water, unless it's on a ship or a small island. And so most raptors that use thermals or slope lift don't want to migrate out over the water. As an example, there is a species of snake eagle, which occurs here in very small numbers, the short-toed snake eagle, and those that live in Italy don't cross through Sicily and Malta to Africa. They go all the way up around through southern France and then back down through Spain, and they cross at the Straits of Gibraltar, which is a longer distance, but then they don't have to cross over open water. So the Red Sea between the Arabian Peninsula and Africa also acts as a deflection barrier because the raptors can't cross on it. So some of the raptors coming from Asia, Western Asia, going into Africa, go across the northern part, and they cross into Sinai, get up around Suez, or they can cross right in here at the southern part of Suez. Others of them concentrate along here. What's not shown is a lot of them fly here, hit the Red Sea, and then they go along the Red Sea until they get to Bab el-Mandab, the Straits of Hormuz, and they cross from Yemen into Djibouti. The little country of Djibouti is right here, and raptor counts have been done there. And in the springtime, those same raptors going back north and going east, back into Western Asia, again, the Red Sea acts as a deflection barrier. There's many fewer crossing at this point. Some of them do cross, but there are many more that cross at the northern part of the Dead Sea. Well, I'll start off by talking now about count sites with each continent. And I'll start off with North America because the first counts done of raptors that we know about was done in North America. And these are the count sites. Now you'll notice that there's a concentration of them in this area right here. And much of it is because all the raptors coming from here go south and they hit the Atlantic Ocean. And so they have to make a right turn and go along the coast. And one of the best places is Cape May down here, which is a peninsula. But there's also some ridges here. And then we have the Great Lakes in North America, big bodies of water where the raptors are also concentrated. I'm going to talk now about two places where, and I forgot again, I did this last time. There are so many hawk counters in North America that early on they all got together and they formed an organization, the Hawk Migration Association of North America, and they now have a website where they get counts from everybody, and they have a journal where you can publish your counts and you can publish articles about raptor counting, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm going to talk about two famous sites, at least famous in North America, Hawk Mountain, which was the first site where raptor was done, and Cape May, New Jersey, which is another famous site. So this is where Hawk Mountain is, right in the middle of all these, and then Cape May is right down at the southern end there. So Hawk Mountain Sanctuary was set up as a sanctuary because people, the local people, would go up to this mountain where the raptors were migrating by and shoot them. And they did this for many years. It was set up in the 1930s because to try to prevent these guys from shooting this and to change people's attitudes about birds of prey. And so all of these birds here are dead birds that somebody picked up and put out for a photograph in the 1930s. And so it's a long story. You could actually spend the whole time just talking about Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. But one of the things that they did early on was to start a count. And this is now the site where the count is done, but that's where the shooters were when the raptors came flying right up the ridge line. And they were using the slope lift off of the ridge to migrate, and the raptors, they were being shot. Now they're just being counted and photographed. The second place is at Cape May, which is at the southern end of this peninsula. Now, I've told you that the land on the eastern seaboard of North America goes from northeast to southwest. So all these raptors coming down, all of a sudden they hit the ocean and they make a right turn. And they come, and they keep coming along the shore until they get to Cape May, and all of a sudden there's no more land. There's just a peninsula that points south, and the raptors come, and all they see is ocean on three sides. So they drop down, lower, and circle around, and it's about 20 kilometers to go across this Delaware Bay. And many of them don't want to do that. It depends on the wind direction. So they drop down and they go back up north and cross up here where it's less than a kilometer across. So many years ago, we set up the Cape May Bird Observatory. One of the things that the Bird Observatory does is to maintain a count. And in fact, there's a huge count platform, and the count is featured very much. Prior to that, I set up a banding station there for banding raptors, and the Cape May Raptor Banding Project. And you can see when I started that, we have banded over 140,000 raptors since that time. And we have recoveries from all the way down into South America and all through there. We don't have any, we have recoveries in the Caribbean. We don't have any recoveries in Asia or Europe yet, but we may get that. Anyhow, that's me with these are raptors in the hand. This is an American kestrel and a Cooper's hawk. And this is me with the first bald eagle. It's a juvenile bald eagle, the first one that I've been able to catch. These are some of the migrant raptors that occur in North America. Sharp-shinned hawk, which is very much like Japanese sparrowhawk. And broad-winged hawk, which is a small buteo, and it's somewhat similar to the gray-faced buzzard. Northern harrier is, we have quite a good migration of them. It's really a different species from hen harrier. American kestrel is much smaller than common kestrel. The New World vultures are completely different from Old World vultures, and we get turkey vultures migrating through there. And the red-tailed hawk is a buzzard. It should be called red-tailed buzzard, but that's another story. We have this funny name for this bird, and we get quite a few of those. There are other count sites throughout North America. I want to talk now about one of the more unusual ones, and that's way up in Alaska. And you'll see that there are very few counts even in southern Canada here, but this one's way up here in Alaska. And what's interesting about it is it's a spring migration count. And it's also unusual in that the most common bird is a Harlan's hawk. And it's done in snow, with snow on the ground. And the temperature, the whole time I've been there, twice for 10 days each, the temperature never got above 0 the whole time, centigrade. So, but if you have warm clothes on and it's not snowing, it's really pretty nice. And to see so many raptors, one day we had a tremendous flight of almost 1,000 raptors in one day with 2 of the local bird clubs there with maybe 50, 100 people there. Okay, so anyhow, it's a wonderful place to look at, particularly this particular taxon, which right now is classified as a red-tailed hawk, even if it doesn't have a red tail. I think it's a mistake that other people argue with that. Anyhow, it's a very interesting place. And the next place I'm going to talk about is Hawk Ridge in Minnesota, and its concentration because of the Lake Superior, this long lake, and it's probably 600 or 700 kilometers long, and it goes from northeast to southwest, and the raptors coming out of Canada hit this lake, and they concentrate along there, and there's also a ridge right at Duluth, and so they get a count totals of about a quarter of what we get here to a third of what you get here. And most of the raptors are pretty low too. And I also want to point out this guy was doing the count there for many years. He's now running the banding station, but he started off at Cape May. And this guy to me is the super hawk watcher, hawk counter. He has eyes that are a little bit bigger than any of ours. And he also has a concentration. He doesn't let anything bother him. And he's able to see raptors farther than any other person I've ever met. In southern Texas, where I live, just north of where I live, we get the largest count of raptors in North America. And it's because tremendous flocks of broadwing hawks, which are coming from all over most of Canada and eastern North America, concentrate there because of the Gulf of Mexico. So they can't fly across the Gulf of Mexico. So everything from over here. And then they also want to fly down here, and I'll talk about this in a minute, and so they concentrate there. And they usually have over 100,000 raptors, most of which are broadwing hawks. But also they get a good number of this bird, which is the swallowtail kite, which is really a spectacular bird to see, and people will go there just to see numbers of swallowtail kites. The next place is Veracruz down in Mexico, which is located on the Gulf of Mexico, and it's just a straight shot down. And Veracruz has a tremendous concentration of 4 to 7 million birds. This is the world's largest count that we know about, the world's biggest concentration. It's the largest count, but it may be the biggest concentration. And it's kind of nice because most of the birds are in sight. They don't go out of sight just because of the local weather conditions. It's concentrated because to the west of Veracruz, there is a series of extinct volcanoes that form a barrier, and they actually go up into the clouds. And so raptors coming south will all of a sudden hit this barrier and this clouds, and there are no thermals in the clouds. So if they want to use thermals, they have to make a left turn and go over to the east, where there is a narrow coastal plain that's only 5 to 20 kilometers wide. And there they can get thermals, and so this whole bunch concentrates through there. That's probably the best place to do the count, but it's not done there. Why? Because, before I get there, let me show you a map of Swainson's hawk, which is the world's second longest raptor migrant. I'll show you the first a little bit later. They come from all over North America, and they go down into South America, into the country of Argentina, and my colleague Sergio took us down to see the birds in the northern winter, the southern summer, and they're here in this large, this is going to work, this large area here. And it's amazing that they concentrate there. And the reason we have this map is this is a bunch of birds that had satellite transmitters put on their backs because one guy put 2 satellite transmitters on the back a few years earlier, and they went to Argentina. He went down to find his birds, And when he got down there, he never found his birds, but what he did find were many dead birds. They were dying because the local farmers were putting on a very bad poison called monocrotophos. And for the grasshoppers, they were trying to kill grasshoppers, and of course, some of the grasshoppers weren't quite dead; they were injured, and so the Swainson's hawks, which is really a buteo, Swainson's buzzards, were picking them up and eating them, and then they were dying. And so immediately they wanted to find out where the birds down there were coming from. So many people throughout North America and the United States and Canada put satellite transmitters on their birds, and they followed them all. And what happens is once they get to Veracruz, you'll see that the concentration was very narrow, and all through Central America, going across South America, crossing over the Andes, crossing over the Amazon rainforest, there is still a very narrow path that these birds take. I think I've wasted the battery on this. It's not working anymore. So I'll use this. Okay. So anyhow, the birds come right down through this narrow path and end up down here. The government of Argentina jumped on this real quickly, and they worked with the pesticide manufacturers, and they got all of that pesticide pulled back. That they sold it back to the farmers. They quit using that one. They started using other things, and Sergio, I'm correct that the problem no longer exists, right?
Yeah, it's been solved.
It's been solved, and very quickly, so it's nice. But in the meantime, we've learned a lot about the migration by putting these satellite transmitters. Okay, so now the next thing is the count. The main count at Veracruz is done from the top of a hotel. And you can see that's over here. So right here, this is the top of the hotel. This is looking north. And actually the counters were up in the front. Now the counters are behind. They built a big turret for them behind so that all of the visitors could come in the front and not bother the counters who are up even higher. And so from this hotel, you can watch the count. You can also go back to the back and pick up a telephone and you say, could you bring me a cup of coffee, please? And they'll take an elevator up, and the next 5 minutes later you have coffee, or you can order a lunch, or you can order a cerveza, which is beer, and there. So, and you can stay in the hotel, which has air-conditioned rooms, and you can just get in an elevator, go down to your room when you want to take a nap or something like that. So it's very nice. There is a second count, which is 13 kilometers to the west, and it used to be in a soccer field and also a baseball field. So there's both soccer and baseball going on, and sometimes they have to move the count because there's a game going on. But now they have bought a piece of property and they've built another building there where they do the count, which is up. So it's really quite a fancy thing, and it's done by a conservation organization called Pro Natura. Pro Natura is kind of the Audubon Society of Mexico, and this is Pro Natura of Veracruz. And they've been very good at it. But look at the annual counts that they have here. And these are not the total counts, because sometimes the raptors, under certain conditions, can go farther west, and the count sites don't get them. And every morning, there is a pretty good number of birds that come right down the beach. And right on the beach, the early morning accipiters and harriers and falcons, and those aren't counted either. Okay, so these are some of the counts. Swainson's hawk, Swainson's buzzard, I mentioned before, that's a huge swarm of 3 or 4 different species, and you can get this going on regularly, as you can do it here. Okay, we'll try this again. Okay, the hook-billed kite is a very interesting bird, and what does that shape remind you of? Jordan's baza. This is in a genus that's not supposed to be close, but it may have been very close many years ago. The hook-billed kite. And common blackhawk and Mississippi kite, there are, of course, lots of others. In South America, we don't have very many count sites because there aren't a lot of migrating raptors. There are a few down in the Andes and a few other places. The few raptors, like the white-throated hawk and rufous-thighed kite, are migrants that move north during the austral winter, during the southern winter. In Europe, we talked about the Mediterranean Sea being a barrier. First, I want to talk about Northern Europe, and particularly up in Denmark and in Sweden. And I'm going to talk about a count that occurs in the very southwestern part of Sweden called Falsterbo. It's a little town there, a little resort town. And so here's a map, and this is the town of Falsterbo, and it's actually a peninsula that goes down. And the count is done right down here at the south end of the peninsula. And the raptors come in here, and they go across. And it's only a few kilometers across to some islands that belong to Denmark, and then over to more islands, bigger islands in Denmark. And so most of the raptors concentrate, and they don't fly very high over, so it's a very nice one. The count site itself is on a golf course, and it's at the hole 14 of the golf course. So you not only are watching for raptors, looking back to the north, you're also watching for golf balls. Every time somebody goes, "4," you can hear them across there. And my pack, one time, I was watching raptors, and my pack got hit by a golf ball, but it bounced a couple of times, so it didn't break anything. But it's kind of interesting. So anyhow, the people all stand around the golf course and watch the raptor migration. And so these are some of the species that occur there. Common buzzard, which of course is very different from Japanese buzzard. And although it took a while for the taxonomists to realize that they are very different. Now, differential migration, and this year here, Bob DiCandido, who's going to be talking next, is not doing the counts this year because he is concentrating on looking at the differences in age and sex, and I won't tell any more about that. I'll let you talk about it if you're going to later on. So, but do they come at the same time? And the answer is no. And the guy that's counting there, Niels Kjellin, and you would never get the pronunciation of his Swedish name unless you were Swedish, K-J-E-L-L-N, which is Kjellin. You would never get that. And he did a PhD at Lund University. Here's Niels. He was very nice to us when my Italian colleague and I spent 3 weeks there. But what he found was that based on the age, that certain species, the adults came first. And there's a big list of those there. And other species, the juveniles came first. And for sex, in some species, the females came first. And for other species, the males came first. And for some species, the ages came at the same time and the sexes came at the same time. And so that was a very interesting piece of work. And Bob is going to be testing that with the species here. So around the Mediterranean Sea, as I mentioned before, the flight is deflected both east and west. The eastern part is through Spain, in southern Spain. It's called Gibraltar because of the Straits of Gibraltar, but the count really occurs a little bit farther west at the little town called Tarifa. And there's a little bit of a flight through the Italian peninsula, crossing from into Sicily, and then the small island of Malta, and then over to Tunisia. And then there's a big deflection around the east side through Israel. So at Gibraltar, at Tarifa, these are the migrant species that occur the most, and both of these, interestingly enough, occur here, but in small numbers. So short-toed snake eel and booted eagle occur there in great numbers. They're early on, there's a lot of honey buzzards come through there, western honey buzzards and black kites, but throughout the rest of the migration, these are the birds that occur there the most. So that's on the western side of Gibraltar. On the eastern side, we have different species, and most of them don't occur here. The steppe buzzard does. We saw one this morning up at Radar Hill. Looked very much like this bird here. Maybe not such a black carpopatch. But western honey buzzard and lesser spotted eagle are two of the more common migrants there, as well as lesser kestrel and Levant sparrowhawk. So in Israel, because the flight is not at the same place all the time, it's concentrated by going around the Mediterranean Sea, but then the local geography and the time of day determines where the flight lines are. And they're in thermals and then they're going. But the thermals and the flight lines are moved from east to west throughout the day. So in the early morning, they start off in the Jordan Valley. This is the Jordan River Valley. This is the Sea of Galilee. So they start off here. So in order to do the survey, you had to have different count sites all the way across this about a 60-kilometer line. And I think they had up to 8 count sites operating every day. So 2 or 3 people at each one of those count sites. And they count as, so the ones on the east side get a lot of birds early and then fewer later on. So this is the number of species. You can see there's quite a few species. The actual count sites, the counts over that particular year, a little over 500,000, which is a pretty good number. But what's interesting is the entire population, or almost the entire population of 2 species passes through this area, not only in the autumn, but also in the spring. So Levant sparrowhawk and lesser spotted eagles. Now, there's nowhere are you going to have the entire population doing anything. There's always going to be some mavericks that decide to go a different way, or decide not to migrate that far, or get messed up, go the wrong direction. So, but in any case. Now, in the springtime, Israel also has a count because of the Red Sea, and at the southern end tip of Israel, and that is in the town of Eilat, right there, there is a good count going on. And the count itself is, this is the Gulf of Aqaba, or Gulf of Eilat, this water body here, and I'll use this. Okay, so this water body here is the Gulf of Eilat. This is the town of Eilat. This is in Jordan, and the town of Aqaba is right there. So we're looking east, and there's a road that goes up to the top of this mountain. And so we're up a couple thousand meters above the ground. And the raptors are coming up the sea, up the Gulf, and they're crossing over. And they're coming out of the desert and with thermals and crossing over. I'm okay, I'll just use this. And, but in the morning, so they're fairly low. And sometimes they just come right over top of you across the hill, and sometimes you're looking down on them like you can here, which is the nice thing about being in hilly country. You can look down on raptors. And then as the day goes, they get higher and higher, the thermals get stronger and stronger, and by noontime, by lunchtime, they're out of sight. They're flying so high, the thermals are so strong that the birds, you can't even see them, even big flocks of them. And they're also, because they're so high, they're crossing over the Gulf. And so you don't count again until 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you start seeing them again coming lower and lower. So the counts then, which are 1.1 million in this particular year, so they're generally 1 million. The number of birds that actually pass through there is greater than that, because much of the year you don't get them. Okay, and so with my Israeli colleagues, we set up a raptor banding, raptor ringing station there, and we were using a variety of traps, box traps, balsha trays, bow nets, mist nets, high mist nets, and what have you. And the first year we captured 918, almost 1,000 birds of 16 species. We also caught some interesting birds like Rufous morph of booted eagle, and somebody asked me if I believed there was a Rufous morph, and I said yes, we've captured them. That's different from a dark morph, and a dark morph for the western marsh area. And that was published, a little article about this was published in Sengrouse. Africa gets a lot of migrants coming in from Europe and Asia during the northern winter. And again, they enter through around the Mediterranean and around the Red Sea, 2 big barriers. So there are good concentrations at the entry points going in. But once inside Africa, we don't get very many counts, so we don't know exactly what's going on. I want to mention that the longest distant migrant that we know about is the Amur falcon, which leaves its breeding range in the Amur River of China and Russia, Soviet Union, Russia, and crosses into India. And from India, and all along the west coast of India, they go right up into as high as they can, and then they just take out across the Indian Ocean, and they fly for a couple of days out there using fat. But I think just keep their wings open, and the trade winds in the autumn are that way. So they just follow the trade winds. They hit the coast of Africa, somewhere from Kenya to Tanzania, And they go inland and they stop and they start feeding, and some of the big parks like Savo West, big flocks of them going down eating insects, which they feed on in Africa. And then they move on farther south into South Africa and Zimbabwe, where their main winter grounds are. When they return in the spring, a few of them will cross the ocean, but mostly they just head on the coast, but they aren't really found in much concentrations. Bernd Mayberg, who is a plastic surgeon in Germany, has been doing some satellite tracking of raptors, big raptors, eagles and things for many years, and he finally, somebody developed a little tiny transmitter that they put on Amur falcons, and so they've been tracking them, so they'll have more and more information on them as we go along. In Africa, there are very few really count sites because there isn't much concentration once inside Africa. There are a few, but we have something else going on, which is a wet season, dry season, particularly in West Africa, in this area here. So the Sahara Desert is here, and just south of the Sahara Desert is a drier area, but wetter than the desert, called the Sahel, and then below that is a savanna area. And during the wet season, a lot of the raptors that are in the savanna move up into the Sahel, which has rain, and start breeding. And then when the rain stops and it starts to dry out, they move back again. So twice a year they have this wet season, dry season movement. And it's many different species. A few of them, interestingly enough, move north into the wet area during the wet season, but they don't breed until they come back into the savanna during the dry season. Many others breed in the wet season in the Sahel, so it's kind of interesting. Gymnogene is one of those African species, or it's also called a harrier hawk, African harrier hawk, that does this movement. Only in that area. The rest of it's sedentary in the rest of Africa. Australia has a lot of raptors. There are no raptor counts that we know about in Australia because there are no concentration places. All the movement is broad front. So who wants to get out there and see one raptor a day going over? But as I giving this talk earlier, somebody said, well, how do they know that they migrate? Well, there are 3 or 4 reasons. One of them is when you're at Tasmania, this island in the south, down here, certain species are not there in the austral winter. They leave. So if they're there and they're not there, all of a sudden, you know that they have left and they have moved north. But they've also seen some up at Cape York, this northernmost peninsula. They've seen some birds going over, passing over, going into Papua New Guinea. And so they know there's migration there. Plus the fact that they have banded some of the birds, and the band recoveries indicate that the bird has moved north for the winter. Here are some of the birds that do migrate. Pacific baza, which is an avicida, very similar to Jordan's baza, swamp harrier, and gray goshawk, which is an accipiter. And now we get to Asia, where we are right now, and there is a lot of migration going on in Asia. Much of it, particularly in China, is very broad front, so there aren't very many concentrations until you get near coasts or on islands, Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines. So I'm going to discuss 2 sites where I have been and watched migration. One of them is Beideha in China, and the other is at the very southern tip of Taiwan, Kenting National Park. So Beideha is on the Bay of Bohai, and the town is right here, and it is a resort for, during the communist heyday, for the party workers. And when I went there, things were starting to open up for Westerners, but there were only 2 hotels in the town that could take Westerners, people without Chinese passports and without party membership. So, and that was the early 90s. But it was interesting because on the west side of the town is a group of hills, and that's where some Brits had done some raptor counts, particularly in the springtime, but I went there in the autumn. And I spent 3 weeks in the area, and every morning I went up to the hills and watch the raptors. And they would come until about noon, and then the thermals got too high, and they didn't need the hillside anymore, and so you didn't see any raptors in the afternoon. So the afternoons were for bird watching. Other things. 2 of the days I went north to Shanghai, Guan, which is the eastern terminus of the Great Wall of China. And you see in the picture in the lower right, this is the Great Wall of China, and it comes right down to the ocean. And there is a chairlift that you can get on it, so you don't have to walk up there. There are no roads up there. And so the chairlift takes you right up to the top, and right where the chairlift is, there's a little coffee shop and things, and I just walked over a little bit, and I spent 2 days there watching raptors, and found a couple of species that weren't somewhere else, that weren't down in Beida. But there was definitely migration going on there too. And so Amur falcon was one of the commonest birds there. And northern hobby, which actually looks very similar to the females and juveniles of Amur falcon, and it took a little while to always sort them out. Pied harrier, which occurs here, we've seen 2 adult males of pied harrier. Northern goshawk, which doesn't get here, but Japanese buzzard, which we've seen 4 or 5 of, were fairly common there. I published that in the Hawk Migration Studies. Remember I told you about the Hawk Migration Association of North America. This is one of their publications. And the second place is Kenting National Park, which is at the southern end of Taiwan, down here. And here's the local map. Now this is a national park, but there's also agriculture and everything going on in the national park. I guess you can't shoot there or do a few other things. But down here at the lighthouse, right down here, the raptors are migrating all the way down through Taiwan, and they have come across either from Japan or from the Chinese mainland and end up on Taiwan. There's a ridge of mountains that goes up the east side of Taiwan, and they come down the mountains, and the mountains end, and they keep going, flying the thermals, and they get to that point, and they take a big thermal up on the point, and then they go out across the ocean. And it's ocean, going for the Philippines. They do this until about noon. At noon, they start out and they come back, and they start out and they come back. And then they turn around and they drop down and they flap along the west side of this peninsula, along this west side, and there is a hawkwatch platform on the west side. And so after noon, you get there and you watch the raptors going from south to north, even though it's in the autumn. And they're going to find a place to spend the night, the treat area, and then the next morning they'll go on to cross. So here is the southern end of Taiwan. Here is the northern island of the Philippines, Luzon, and here are some islands there. So they must cross this open stretch of water, and they head then, and also the winds are helping them, they head in a southeasterly direction until they get to those islands. They get some thermals there, and then they head south or more southerly direction to get to Taiwan. And obviously they make it because they keep coming every year. And so afternoon, they turn around and they go back up north. So here are some of the species that are there. And Bob, you'll notice the spelling. I gave this presentation before and I had Bob's name spelled on it. I forgot he would be in the audience, so. Thank you for the photos, Bob. So anyhow, but the main thing is that 95% of the raptors there are these 2 species. There are very few of the Japanese sparrowhawks and very few black kites and very few of the Oriental honey buzzards. There are a few, but very few. But most of them are these 2 species. And then in the morning, then the first thing you can get, everybody gets down to the point. You come watch them get down to the point, get a thermal, or some of them just come to the point flapping, and they just take off, going out over the ocean, just flapping, gaining altitude. And that brings us to here, the Cowden Sort, and of course we're here at the Chumpon Raptor Center, and Bob is going to be talking about what goes here. So, and of course, all of you know this wonderful book, Photographic Guide to the Raptors in Thailand, which understand is being revised. And this is one of Bob and his colleagues' reports for the count. And I don't have the one from 2012, if there is one. I should get one. And so Thanks for your attention, and thank Bob for these wonderful pictures. He's going to show us some more. Chiquette, are we going to have any questions, or are we going to do it afterward?
ครับมีใครถามอะไรบ้างไหมครับ
I don't know how to do this.
I don't get it like for the migration in Taiwan that in the afternoon you meaning that they go to the ocean and they fly
No,
back.
yeah, they come to the point, and they start in the ocean, and they realize that they don't have enough time to get to the Philippines
Okay.
before dark.
Yeah.
So they come back, and they said, I'll do it tomorrow.
Okay.
So they go north and sit in a tree. And then for the night, next morning, first thing, they go.
แบบไปแล้วไม่ทันไงไปแล้วมันกลัวจะมืดก่อนถึงจะกลับมาพัก
They come until the like the point and
Yeah.
turn back.
And then go back
Oh. Okay.
10, 15 kilometers back until they hit some woods with
Right.
trees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so when I was there, we could go back up there and watch them coming back up and landing in the trees and
I see.
flying
How
around.
do the birds know what long
How do they know?
the next trip? How long?
Instinct. The ones that don't know, they fly out, they don't survive. So they don't pass the information on. The ones that do know survive, so they pass the information on to their young.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Serio?
Do you wear your sandals at the Alaska campsite?
I put socks on. Yeah.